In this video, we're going to look at examples that expand our knowledge of how to write the equations of geometric sequences. And we're going to start by finding something called the geometric mean. And the geometric mean basically is referring to missing terms. In this case, they want 3. So you have 1, 2, 3 missing terms before you get to 4. Start at 1,024, end up at 4, and then we need to figure out how to get there. And this is going to require us to find r. Well, we learned in the previous examples that r is found by taking a2 divided by a1, but I don't have a2. But what I do have is I have a5. So you can actually do this, okay, doing the same idea, finding, remember, the common ratio. So the ratio in this problem would be 4 divided by 1,024. Now, the problem is we have to remember that we're taking a5 and dividing a1. So because those aren't adjacent, when they're adjacent, it's simple. You just divide and you're done. And the reason is you don't need to do any additional math. But remember, we're doing an exponential equation. So the way you undo an exponential is to take the square root of its exponent. And so to simplify this fraction, I also need to root the difference of these terms, in this case, 5 minus 1. Now, a lot of students will see that and like, that looks complicated. It's really not that bad, but you're going to have to use a calculator, clearly. But they also ask, why didn't you do it over here when you did a2 divided by a1? And the reason is the root there would be 2 minus 1, and that would be the 1 root, which isn't a thing, right? The 1 root is just raise it to the first power. So it doesn't matter when they're adjacent. It only matters when there's gaps between the terms you're dividing. So let's take a look at how to find this common ratio. The first thing we're going to do is divide 4 divided by 1,024 to reduce that fraction. If you're using an online calculator like Desmos, there's a little toggle button here. It says convert to fraction. So that's 1 over 256. And so this comes out to the 4th root of 1 over 256. And if you are using a regular, Casio or TI calculator, there's root buttons on those as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this answer and we're going to do the in root, right, which would be 4, and then we're going to put in here 1 divided by 256. I guess you could have put the original thing in there if you wanted, and that will toggle to a 4th. So what is the r value in this problem? It is a 4th. How did I get it? I used the values they gave me. I used iteration to determine I used iteration to determine how far away they were. And then I found the difference of their how far away they were. I turned that into a root, and then I did their division just like I would in a normal r problem. So now that I know that r is a 4th, I'm just going to come over here and multiply by a 4th. I'm going to multiply the next term by a 4th, and I'm going to multiply the next term by a 4th, and then I'm going to multiply it by a 4th, and hopefully I will return to 4. So 1,024 times 1/4, or divided by 4. Remember, you can't really say divided by 4 in the formula, but if you want to think about that when you're going from term to term, that's fine. So 1,024 times a 4th is 256, and 256 times 1/4 is 64. And 64 times a 4th is 16, and sure enough, 16 times a 4th is 4. And so it's kind of nice, you always get the answer that they gave you in the problem as a check. So the reason we learned that is we're going to need it when we start looking at writing recursive and explicit formulas given information. So in this first problem, we're just given a problem, and we're going to learn how to write the explicit formula for it, and then the recursive. And then over here, we'll have to do a little bit of extra work to find r. So let's just review that concept of how to find r again. In this problem, to find r, what we're going to do is we're going to take a2 and divide by a1. And the reason we don't need a root is the root would be 2 minus 1, which would be the first root, which is actually raising something to the first power. So we luckily, in this problem, can just divide 9 divided by 6, right? a2 divided by a1. And that, of course, will give 3 halves. And so that's our r value. And then to write the explicit is just incredibly easy for geometric. It's an is equal to a1 r to the n minus 1. And so once again, a1 is given. Now notice over here it's not. So that's why we had to learn those other things. So what we're going to do is we're now going to say an is equal to 6 times the r value that I found right here, 3/2, and then the n minus 1. And again, just leave this formula alone. Don't simplify it. There's your explicit. Leave it alone. To find the recursive is always to state a1. a1 is 6. Just like you do here, you say 6, you have to do the same thing here. And then you say any term after this is to multiply the term before, so n minus 1, and then you multiply that times the r value, 3/2. Some people put it in a parentheses instead of a multiplication. Some people put it in a parentheses and use multiplication, whatever you want to do. All right, so that's the first two parts of that problem. The next thing it wants us to do is, could you find a10? And the purpose of that is to realize, okay, if I'm going to find a10, I'm going to use this, right? I'm not going to use recursive because I'd have to do this 10 times. So to find a10, we're going to use specifically the explicit formula, and that will be 6 3/2 raised to the 10 minus 1. And I always like to tell students, make sure you actually simplify easy things before you type it in the calculator, because it's actually just less frustrating to type into the calculator to the 9th power. So let's take a look at that. That's not something you can do in your head. So 6 and then parentheses 3/2. And then make sure you're clicking out of the parentheses, even if you are using a calculator that's handheld. And then you raise that to the 9th power, and you get a crazy number. But if you toggle this, you get that. Now, I'm going to show you something interesting that you can do as well that I think is important. So one of the answers is that fraction, right? So that fraction is 59,049 divided by 256. So one thing that students don't know about how numbers typically work on a calculator is, let's say I wanted to write that as a not improper fraction. I wanted to write it as a mixed number. The way you would do that is you would want to find what this piece is. And so what's beautiful about a calculator that's like Desmos is you can literally just copy that, hit enter, and then put it here, and then toggle the fraction on that. You have to hit enter. Now, it didn't let me because there's missing decimal points, but if it let me, the toggle would come up and it would work. Now, one way to force it to do that would be to take this and then subtract off the 230, and then you get that decimal, and then it will allow you to toggle. So that problem is actually 230, 169 over 256. And that's an interesting, I think it's an important thing for you to learn how to do, because sometimes writing it as a mixed number is required, or on, especially on an SAT or something, sometimes they just give you those tricky kind of answers that are exactly what you have, but they just decide to take it a step further just because, they're trying to make sure you're paying attention or something. So again, the way that I did that was I took the answer and I realized, well, I've got a 230 here. And if I subtract that out, it'll leave me with the decimal that's behind it. And then that decimal that's behind it was converted. So yeah, I have that same decimal, it's just more decimal places. And then it would allow me to convert it to 169 256. Just an important calculator skill that you maybe don't know about. All right, so how do we do number 7? Well, let's just start trying to write out the equation and see what we're missing. And unfortunately, for the explicit formula, an is equal to a1 r to the n minus 1. We're actually missing everything, right? We don't have a1 or r. So we learned when we did this geometric mean problem that we can find r between any two terms as long as we use a root that shows their difference. So in this problem, to find r, what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to say, okay, they gave us a7 and they gave us a4, and to find r, I would divide those because it's a common ratio, but I'd have to root the difference between the two. So 7 minus 4. So in this case, r will be the third root of the ratio 192 divided by negative 24. And I wouldn't trust, I just wouldn't trust your brain on this. You're going to want to make sure you're using a calculator. All right, and so 192 divided by negative 24 is going to be a negative number, which makes sense. Okay, so we end up getting -8, so we actually can do the next part ourselves. And so remember how roots work. If this were a square root, this would be a problem because it would be imaginary. but the cube root of a negative number is a negative. That's a very important thing to remember in algebra. Odd roots are negative, even roots are problematic. So if you needed to do that, what you would do is you'd come here. If you really wanted to know what it was, you'd say cube root of -8. If you don't trust your memory, and sure enough, it is -2. So now we can put that back into the equation. Okay, so the equation is now going to give us an is equal to a1, and I now have this little piece of information, right? I have -2. So how do you find a1? Well, I could iterate and then work backwards, or I could use the fact that the formula actually means any term. So to find any term, what you're going to do is you're going to take a little break over here and use the formula in that way. So you're going to say an is equal to a1 -2 to the n minus 1. They gave us several terms. They gave us 4 and 7. So we'll use a4 just because typically math is easier if you use smaller numbers. I will say that if a7 were a smaller number, I probably would have used a7. All right, we're solving for a1, so we'll just leave that there. We have a -2 here. And then here we get to put a 4 minus 1, and that's how this will work. A4 is defined as -24, so I put a -24 there. A1 is multiplied times -2 to the third power. -2 to the third power is -8. And then all I do now is just divide by -8. And once I divide by -8, I get that a1 is 3. Pretty neat how you can do that. So now we finally have our final equation for the explicit formula. The explicit formula is an is equal to 3 times -2 to the n minus 1. So it's interesting how you can use the formula to find missing pieces of the formula before you know the answer to begin with. Now, to do the recursive, all the information is already given to us right here. So the recursive is saying find a1, we have that, and then find an by multiplying by r, which is r is -2, and then times an minus 1. And so if you look at this, this is why people will say, okay, we need a multiplication sign here. Some people will use a parentheses. It just doesn't matter, okay? A1, of course, we need to state what that is, and that was 3. So here's your recursive, okay? And then the last thing it says to do is to find a of 10. And so a of 10 is found by using the explicit, and this again is just a calculator exercise. It's actually an identification of which formula to use exercise as well. And so a of 10 is 3 times -2 to the 9th, and that's just going to be an enormous number. It could be positive, it could be negative. Let's take a look at what it is. So to do this one, we would have 3 and then a parentheses -2. And then we would raise that to the, make sure you click out of that parentheses or else it'll try to do it inside, to the 9th power. And that comes out to, not too big, -1,536. -1,536. So not so bad. Just make sure that you're using a calculator with these kind of problems, and make sure that you understand how to find r using a common ratio and a difference of the root. And make sure you remember that an means any term. So if they give you any term and you know r, you can actually always find a1, because the term number will reduce the exponent, and the term value will allow you to find a division and get the answer.